And I have a presentation which is amazing, so I can tell you about edge rendering with Nuxt, which is probably what you're more interested in than my home on the banks of the River Wear, which I could also talk about. My own background, just to add, is really from the agency and SaaS startup perspective. So that was my route into open source. And so when I'm looking at and thinking about what we can do with Nuxt or Nitro, that's where I'm coming from. I guess we all come from different perspectives, but that's me. So I wanted to give you a little view of home. This is where I work. That's my desk view, and that's one of the cats. So if you're ever... How many of them you have? There are 3. I just want to repeat, we have 3 cats. They are very nice, but this one is the most polite. She doesn't sit on my keyboard most of the time. There are certainly issues and PRs that I have submitted, created, closed by cat, which I do apologize for if that's affected any of you in future. But if you are ever messaging me on Twitter or creating an issue or Discord or however it is, I'm probably sitting here, I'm probably having a cup of tea or coffee. That's me. So let me tell you about Nuxt. If you don't know about Nuxt, you probably know about Nuxt, but if you don't know about Nuxt, actually, who here doesn't know about Nuxt? Raise a hand. That's great. Okay, I'm engaging with you. Nuxt is a framework for building web applications, and you might know about it from Nuxt 2. What I particularly like about Nuxt is that it's progressive, so you don't need anything to start. You just create a Nuxt app using the command line tool, and you can just say Nuxt start, Nuxt builds. That's all you really need to do. Best practices are built in. You can take full control. You customize absolutely everything about Nuxt through quite an advanced hooks and configuration mechanism, but really you get a server-side rendering out of the box. All the files in your pages directory get turned into roots with automatic bundle splitting. Lots of really cool features, which I won't particularly go into. That's all Nuxt 2, and we've basically built on that for Nuxt 3 and added quite a lot more amazing things, which I won't get a chance to show you today, but which I absolutely am really excited about from a developer experience point of view. It's super minimal, fully typed, everything is magical. I'm not meant to talk about it today, but maybe at the end, if I'm forced to and the pizza hasn't arrived, I'll show you some cool stuff about Nuxt 3. What I particularly want to talk about, though, is some drivers that are moving how we build, how we think about web applications in 2022, which I think is the year we're in, but I'm not entirely sure, because there was this thing that happened over the last 2 years that's really confused me. And in 2022 and in 2021, and this sort of movement that we're going, that was COVID, I'm talking about COVID, I'm talking about a global pandemic, I just want to say. That was what I was mentioning. But in 2022, we're seeing a move towards serverless. We're seeing a move towards different technologies. You'll be thinking about Cloudflare Workers or Dino. Netlify just announced a really cool rendering feature, but it's all running on Dino at the edge, close to users. There are a lot of really interesting things that are happening at the moment, and a lot of them are different from the traditional model of a server-rendered application that we've traditionally thought about, which is on some VPS somewhere, you've got a server running and it handles requests and sends stuff back. That's not really what we're talking about at the moment. But at the same time, there are some things that haven't changed. So the importance of fully rendered HTML, ideally static site generated, or server-side rendered, but having something to deliver to your users so that from the very first moment they get something in their browser, they're seeing something that they can interact with and consume and have an experience with, as opposed to a blank page that then has to download JavaScript and hydrate. And that's something that you can see from all kinds of top companies. Go on vuetelescope.com. It's a pretty cool site if you've not come across it. You can explore websites built in Vue, lots of different frameworks. This one, TikTok, the business page is built in Nuxt, and it matters to them that they are able to have an SSR rendered website. It gives them better SEO. It enables all kinds of wonderful things that you should all talk to Philip about afterwards. That matters. So we started at ground zero for Nuxt 3 in thinking about this particular component of Nuxt 3, which is the server bit of it. There's lots more from the Vue 3 perspective and thinking about how we create a good experience, how we have a great performance on the client-side JavaScript, but particularly thinking about what we do with the server component in Nuxt 3, we went back to ground zero and we created something new called Nitro. And Nitro is actually now released as not something that's just usable in Nuxt 3. Anybody can use it. Dare I say it, anybody can build a framework on top of it. Anyone can adapt an existing framework on top of it. The aim is this is open. We want this to be the future of where we're going with servers in building for the edge. And in particular, the Nitro vision is to be able to create something, a JavaScript server, that can run anywhere. It can run in your browser's service worker. It can run in Node. It can run in Dino. It can run on the edge. Anywhere you can think of where JavaScript can run, we want your server to be able to run. So you can render HTML direct to the users with absolute minimal time to first write. And so we're having to think about how we optimize for speed and quick time to first byte. So that's cold start, for example, is a term you may have come across before in thinking about serverless, because serverless computing doesn't necessarily have one server that handles loads of requests. It has individual handlers that might each handle only one or a few requests at a time, or indeed there may be other approaches which use Docker and effectively are a little bit more like traditional servers. But basically, this process of starting the server becomes really important. Because you might get a request coming in, and the provider says, oh, I've got to start some kind of server to respond to this. So Nitro, we've had to really rethink everything about the server that we use for Nuxt. Here are a few things that we care about with Nitro. And by the way, this is all online. You can go visit nitro.unjs.io. Nitro is probably the flagship project of the UnJS GitHub organization. It's about universal JavaScript that's relevant for deploying, writing JavaScript anywhere for everyone. And so check it out. There are a lot of cool packages there, if I do say so myself, but it's definitely worth looking at. I'm going to dive into a few different tools that we've used in building Nitro that will tell you a little bit about what it can do and why. And hopefully at the end, we'll have a bit of a feel for what Nitro is and what it can do and why that makes a difference for Nuxt. And if I don't deliver on any of that, please make a note and make me answer it in the questions afterwards. So the first tool in the toolbox that we're using with Nitro is Rollup. Now, because Nitro takes, in the case of Nuxt, it takes the build output of your Nuxt project, which might be created by Vite or Webpack or some other thing that you're using. You can create your own build bundler for Nuxt, though you're probably not doing that. And Nitro consumes that as one route in a server. This handler is going to handle rendering HTML stuff. And there'll also be other routes and other handlers for your server API and other bits. Nitro processes that with a magical rollup configuration. If you're taking a look at the source code, start with that, the rollup config. That's probably a good place to start. And it produces, at the end of the day, a single JavaScript file, an ES module .mjs that can be run standalone. So there's no external dependency required to start that server. It has all it needs itself. Nitro does some other cool things as well with Unplugin, which is a framework for building plugins that transform code that works seamlessly in Rollup, Vite, and Webpack. So if you're looking to do something universal that's cool, try that. And I should say Rollup and the ease of writing Rollup plugins is why I think we're seeing such exciting developments in the field of Vite and other projects built upon it. It's just easy to do. And it means that people can go very quickly from idea to development to build. And if you have a cool idea for a plugin that will make your life easier in terms of your build process, or a dev process, consider writing one. Take a look at unplugin. So with Nitro, we use a tool called unenv. The aim here is to, these are all things we've built as part of the project and released in open source separately, just to be clear. So unenv is a tool for making the environment-specific dependencies of a project work in other environments. So it's a collection of shims and mocks and stubs and re-implementations and all kinds of things for different environments. So if you're wanting to build a Vue project, at the moment, Vue has a hard dependency on Node for the server renderer. So we have to stub and mock quite a lot of dependencies in order to make it possible to run that in Cloudflare Workers, which is not a Node environment. And so we have a couple of presets to start with. So we've got a node, I've got a nodeless Dino you'll be able to see pretty soon. And basically, it's just a set of configurations. Here is what we can do to make things more minimal. And in some cases, it is just making them more minimal, taking big packages and replacing them with packages that work in the same way, but which are tiny and optimized for an environment where space matters, which is a change from the previous server. We also use an amazing tool from the Vercel team called NFT, Node File Trace. Which could mean so many other things. I get confused all the time. But basically what this does is it takes a look at the actual, we have our own implementation with it. So as we're building out that server, we look at all the imports and all the things that are used in the server. And then we run Vercel's Node File Trace on those and take just the bits of those packages and the bits of that code that are actually used. And we copy them into a separate node modules directory so that at the end of a build process, you have your server entry point, and it has some dynamic imports and things that we can talk about in a moment. It has your public files, the stuff that will be served as a static file server. And then it has its own node modules folder, which has been optimized by Vercel's node file trace and our own plugin implementation, which is tiny compared to if you just ran an npm install or something, even just on the actual dependencies that we used. It's amazing. So this is a little bit what it looks like. So I recorded this earlier, clicking into a directory. I thought, how can I display a directory? So I hope this will do. This is all the node modules that you have in an out-of-the-box Nuxt 3 project. That's it. And you can see that the files that are actually within them, they're only the files that are needed. We strip out things like readmes and all kinds of other things. And that means we were able to go from, this is an out-of-the-box Nuxt 2 project, to an out-of-the-box Nuxt 3 project, production build, 50 meg to 516 kilobytes of node modules. Can I just take a moment and say, that sends shivers down. Of course it sends shivers down my back. I mean, but do you think that doesn't send shivers down your back? 716. Yeah. What did I say? Something else. It's 716. That's amazing. And it means, what's the implication? Well, the implication is that you're going to be able to fit your Nuxt Lambda in some serverless environment where you actually don't have a lot of space to play with. You don't have 50 meg of disk space quota. You actually only have a meg, like Cloudflare Workers. That's all you have to play with. But you can now, with Nitro, you can write a full Nuxt app and stick it there, and it will work. And although the Cloudflare environment's a little bit different because we're not producing a node modules folder, but you'll forgive me for a moment, the point is the code is tiny. On Cloudflare, we inline everything. We basically create a single file. We do a bit more as well. Avoiding network requests. Now, network requests are the single biggest barrier, I think, to speedy SSR rendering. Certainly they are now with Nitro because we've tried to cut back everything else as much as possible. If you are making an HTTP request, it has lots of overhead. So it has to leave your application, it has to hit the operating system layer, requests are created, particularly if that request then just comes straight back to your application. If you've ever written, say, a call in the Vue part of your app that needs to go to the server part of your app, you're making a full network request to do that. We don't need to do that with Nitro. With Nitro, we fully mock the fetch. We provide this isomorphic fetch function, $fetch, which is available throughout your app. And if you call that on the client side, it makes a network request to your server. If you call that on the server side, it directly hits the endpoint like a function call with fake request response objects, gets the result, and brings it back, which means it is super fast. You can also use that same fetch function to hit remote URLs as well. It's not just for local calls, but it does enable local calls to entirely bypass the network layer, which makes a huge difference for performance as well. I mean, you want to avoid remote calls in general if you can on the server. But this makes it so much more possible to perform local calls as though they're just other parts of your code. And we built a new HTTP framework called H3. It's an HTTP framework, unlike Express, for example, that can actually run in your browser. You can run it in a service worker. You can run it anywhere. It is tiny, and our current tests are that it is the most performant HTTP framework out there at the moment. Now, I've got to say, benchmarks are terrible, particularly for things like this, because they often measure things that don't matter in real world. But it is really fast, and you should check it out. On top of that, both fetch that I mentioned before and H3 come with amazing convenience functions. So you can directly return the results of your handler. So no need to call, res set header content type application JSON, res end JSON stringify, whatever. You just return an object from your event handler. Same with fetch and the isomorphic fetch. One of the things that I love about it most is that it smartly parses the response. If it has a string coming back with an application JSON, it knows it's going to parse that as JSON. And it can do all kinds of other things as well. And we're actually moving with H3 towards a new fetch event spec compliant implementation, but still exposing the underlying request and response objects. And we move, as much as possible, any kind of expensive operation, by expensive I mean time-consuming, from request time to generate time. Because we have a build step, right? We know all the files that we're going to serve, so why on earth should we calculate an e-tag per request? It's a terrible thing to do. I mean, it's all very well if you're expecting to serve a static directory that might have someone FTP new files into it, but that doesn't match the current serverless world we're living in. Deployments are often immutable. We have a build step, and we know what's there. So we can produce a manifest with modified time, e-tag, MIME type of all the static files you have as part of your application, which means that can then directly be served as part of the response. It's just, I mean, we're talking about saving millisecond after millisecond, but it matters, and it adds up. And maybe the tiny little thing, number 3 at the bottom of this particular slide, is the one I'm most interested in. Because what we're talking about, we've already actually implemented it, but we're enhancing it, and you'll see some new announcements about this in the coming weeks, is fully implemented root rules for a Nuxt application. And when I'm talking about a root rule, I'm saying something like, all the paths under admin, those should be client-side only. We don't want to server-side render them. Those can be client-side only. These paths over here, we're going to static generate them in advance. These ones over here, we have a revalidation strategy, and they can be revalidated in this kind of way. These paths should have CORS headers applied to them. These paths should have these kind of cache headers applied to them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It makes your site incredibly granular in terms of actually doing the kind of performance optimization that you might want to do to make it ultimately performant. At the moment, Nuxt 3 has, you can generate the whole site, and anything that isn't generated can be served by a fallback SSR. Nuxt 2, we do have this. We have it there's a Versal builder at the moment, which has the ability to generate some files in advance and then server-side render the ones that aren't. And basically, by copying what we do there, you can do it yourself as well. But don't do that. Come to Nuxt 3. It's definitely better. The water is warm. We're in release candidate, by the way. I can't even wait to show you things like this. OhMyFetch and H3 enable us to provide you with fully typed responses to that fetch hook I mentioned. You can write an API handler which does this, return an object with a URL, and when you call it in your component, you are actually going to get that data object there is fully typed. You're going to be able to run type checks on that because we know what the type should be by inspecting the endpoint. And we know what the type of the data should be when you're actually using it in your component. And you get that in your IDE as well for free. That is fully workable code, just there. No more imports required. It just works. And this is the result. This is I'm just going to stand in front of the key numbers, shall I? This is the result. This is a bog standard Nuxt 2 app with the ultimate minimal configuration using Nuxt Start, which is a special distribution required just to start a built Nuxt app, versus Nitro. And this is basically hitting the time required from executing the JavaScript to the point where the server is actually listening. 3 milliseconds for Nitro. 314, which was not bad for Nuxt 2. But 3 makes a big difference, and it means if you're looking at the cold start of your new Nuxt 3 app, any performance issues with that cold start probably not going to be coming from Nitro. They might be coming from things like other requests that might be making, initializing a database connection. There might be other issues, but it's probably not the Nitro itself doing cold start. Now, this is not the same thing as actually returning a response. That will add on top of it as well. I'm looking forward to showing that to you in just a quick demo if we have time. But it's not just that. It's not just fast. It's not just small, which makes a difference. When you're unzipping a Lambda, it makes a difference how big it is as well. We also detect where you're deploying it when you're deploying it. So as much as possible, the platforms for deploying your Nuxt app are zero config. So we're using standard env, which anybody can use. It tells you all kinds of things like what operating system you're on, what CI provider you're on, whether it's a local environment, production environment, whether there's interactivity allowed, as in whether you're running it yourself in the console or just running it in a script. But it also is able to tell us about what provider you're running. So we have zero configuration for a Nuxt 3 application on Azure, on Netlify, on Versal, and then tiny minimal configuration, i.e. a configuration file you can copy and paste for Cloudflare, Firebase, AWS, etc. This is one of my sites. This is just a site that you probably can't see it. It's tiny. This is one of my sites, and I don't know if you can tell. It's less than a minute to deploy, build, install dependencies, deploy website, fully SSR up there using a static while we validate strategy so that it is instant on first hit. That's amazing. I love it. That's incredible. Anyway. And it's fully configurable. So you can basically write your own preset. All the presets are a simple JavaScript file that are effectively the same as configuration for the Nitro object in your Nuxt config. You can do the same and write your own preset, add it, whatever you use, whatever deployment platform you're using. If it's not already there, we can make it zero config. We can make it part of Nuxt, and you can deploy the same code anywhere. That's what we're aiming for. Now, I want to show you a little bit of what it actually is like. So if I start a new Nuxt app, this is I want to, as much as possible, to show you what it feels like and what it looks like in the moments we have. So if you're starting your new Nuxt 3 app, we have a CLI. I'm just going to use PNPM because it is so fast. So you have your new Nuxt application we create. And out of the box, that new Nuxt app is going to be incredibly minimal. So there's just going to be an app.vue file. There's going to be some node modules. I probably should have opened VS Code before this point. And a tsconfig. And all the magic that we're going to do is basically done through the tsconfig. I'm just going to run the dev server in the background, which is going to enable a lot of the magic. So I talked about deploying to, I talked about rendering on the edge. So I want to show you a little bit about that, what it might look like. If you create a file in server API, that is going to be automatically read in by Nuxt as a server root called API/test. We have other much more complicated ones. You could do test.get. Oops. That will only respond to GET requests. And there are lots more other cool features like that. You can even have dynamic parameters and things like that actually in your API directory. And what you see is that we actually generate here in this, this nitro.d.ts file in the .nuxt folder, the actual types for the responses to those endpoints. That's how it's possible for us to do something like this. So export default, define event handler. By the way, you should see that this is fully typed. No imports are required in a Nuxt app anymore. We detect when they're used, and we automatically inject them in your code. And that's true also in your server-side code as well. And then we expose them to your editor in your, all the files that are pulled in from the tsconfig. So you actually get correct types and documentation when you're using them. So in this case, I'm just going to say, hey. Now if I go into my Nuxt app here, and I use a cool, the cool script setup feature, I'm just going to get a response. Have a look at that. Oh dear. Well, that's fun, isn't it now? You know what I'm going to be doing tonight. I'm going to be tracking this little thing down. What you should see at this point is that we have a beautifully fully typed data object flowing in here.
Test directory and the file inside the test directory.
Oh, that's right. It's working perfectly. Let's try this. It's an operator error. Yes, it is an operator error. Do you know, I'm actually going to be able to sleep tonight. That's going to make a difference. OK, so you can actually then use this data property in your we've got a message value, right? You can actually then use that in your template. That's pretty cool, I think. You can also do other really interesting things, like share configuration, dynamic configuration with your app. So we have a runtime config property where you can set something like base URL, well, base URL is a bad example, some secret token. And you can have a sort of default value. This is fully overridable all the way throughout your application when you're actually running it by environment variables. So you can actually switch your app from CDN to no CDN to back to CDN to change the base URL with only the 3 milliseconds required to actually restart your Nitro server. It is fully enabled at runtime by a environment variable. I'm just going to give you a little vision of what happens when we build a Nitro app and we make a request to it. Because although I would love to show you some more Nuxt features, and I'm basically fighting myself not to show them. I'm just going to enable this timing plugin, which actually adds a bit of extra time to the Nitro render, because what it does is it's really sad. It injects code everywhere to measure how long it takes to import bits of your Nitro server. Because if I didn't mention it before, Nitro is fully bundle split on the server side, in your actual server code. So it's not just that the Vue part of your app is bundle split into all of the different pages and lazy component imports you're using. Your server code is as well. So if you have different routes, for example, you might have your Vue app bit of your route. You might also have different API routes. They might import different things, do different things. We have a single handler for all of them, and it would be a terrible thing for cold start if you had to load everything, including Vue, just to return a response to a simple API request. So it's all bundle split. So we've built that. I assume it was quickly, although I didn't see. If we actually just start our app like this, the output folder that I mentioned is here. So it's got all the Nuxt apps, Nuxt public files in there. And typically, you wouldn't want to serve that from your serverless function. You want a CDN to do that. You want some other solution for that, although it can return it. We have all the different chunks here that I've been talking about that are actually bundle split out. So those won't all be loaded, only the ones that are required. You see, for example, we have the test endpoint that we created, or the secretly and disturbingly named test endpoint. Also the Vue 3 renderer, which is going to render the HTML for your website. You'll see that the 3 millisecond promise is in fact correct. I measured it in a slightly different way. If we make a request to, we're going to hit just that test endpoint here, and I just want the headers. So you can see what happened. It says that it's not actually loaded Vue 3, but you see what has actually, the time it's taken to respond. It's something like 1 millisecond, 3, 2 milliseconds. Oops. If we were to load that in the browser, oh, what have I done? We don't want to do that. If I load that in the browser, we're going to actually be able to use something called the server timing API, which I don't know if you're aware of, but by the server setting particular headers on the response object, it can indicate all the different things that are taking time in the response. So we can have something like, for goodness sake. This is not a Nuxt issue, by the way. It's a corruption in my node modules, which I encountered the other day and I haven't fixed yet. I blame myself slightly. Okay, so if you have, I should say, I loaded that, and you see the time required. So it basically took an extra 4 milliseconds on top of the 3 milliseconds to load. If we look at the response here in the network tab, we can see the HTML response. And we can actually investigate the server timings, where you see all the same kinds of things. So the total waiting time was 19 milliseconds. Of which 16 milliseconds was taken up by the Vue portion, by Nitro, rendering the app. That makes sense, right? 3 milliseconds to sort of process the JavaScript itself. And then you can see the specific chunks being loaded here and exactly the time required for each of them. If we hit test again, you'll see that we have a similar kind of thing. It takes 8 milliseconds to respond. That is a little bit about how Nitro works under the hood. It's pretty exciting for me to see this kind of thing happen. It's amazing to see projects start to go live. I saw a job ad posted just the other day in the Nuxt Discord for someone with extensive knowledge of Nuxt 3 required, which I was really impressed by, given that it's only just gone into release candidate. Someone pushed back saying, how can you possibly require this? And the guy said, well, actually, I built the entire MVP that exists at the moment in Nuxt 3, so it's possible. I'm really looking forward to seeing more of that, to seeing more apps built with Nuxt 3. And these kinds of features, well, I mean, we're just talking about the rendering bit. There's so much more to talk about in terms of the developer experience. But this bit is a really key delivery vehicle that enables all of those other ones. So it means that actually then what you get on the other end in terms of user experience is something that feels snappy and responsive. You know, if our barrier is at, 100 milliseconds for the blink of an eye? Was it 200? 100 milliseconds, right? If our Nitro budget is just taking something like 20 milliseconds at its end, that gives us so much more space to play with as devs. And there's a lot of stuff we can do in that. Look, I would love to continue showing off Nuxt 3, and if you ask in a question, I might. But I should open the floor really in a moment. But for now, if you're interested in finding out more or following at all the journey of Nuxt, I'm sure I have some slides here somewhere. If you're interested in following the journey of Nuxt, connect with me on Discord or Twitter or something. I'm Daniel Roe in both places. Follow Nuxt.js on Twitter. Check out the docs, both for v3.nuxtjs.org, and also check out the un.js repository on GitHub. There's so many really interesting packages that I haven't even had time to cover that handle everything from loading configuration to creating CLIs to basically everything that we've done that we think is of value and might be used by someone else. We've tried to split out so it can be, and not just used in the Nuxt projects either. That's everything from me formally. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.